I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us your full name and the postcard you'll be discussing.
I am Elias Jacob Lieberman. I'm rabbi of Falmouth Jewish congregation, and I am discussing this wonderful postcard which depicts the East End Meeting House in East Falmouth.
So the East End Meeting House has a rich history in this community, and it goes way back to the days of the incorporation of our community. Tell us a little bit about
Absolutely. I need to give a shout out. I'm indebted to a couple of people who did some wonderful early research on the Meeting House, one of whom is Reverend Doug Showalter, the minister for many, many years of First Congregational Church here in Falmouth. He's an avid historian, and he did incredible research on the history of the Congregationalist community in Falmouth. And the other is Andrea Rosen, who for her master's thesis in architecture did a study of the history and the structure of the East End Meeting House. So here's what I learned. Back in 1686, among the early settlers in Falmouth decided it was time for a meeting house. So a very simple structure was erected with town funds, probably where Mill Road is in Falmouth today, the old burying ground. Several structures occupied that spot until well into the 1700s. It was decided to move the location of that meeting house, and a simple structure was built on what is now the Falmouth Village Green. Later that became the beautiful First Congregational Church with its beautiful white spire, etc. Later in the 1700s, as the town grew, there was a perceived need for a second meeting house, and there was a debate about where that should be. So the powers that be decided to divide the town in half with a dividing line roughly separating T-Ticket from the rest of Falmouth, Tatticket at that time. And it was decided that the Falmouth Meeting House would be the beautiful white church on the green, and that a new meeting house would be built in East Falmouth. Ezekiel Robinson, one of the early founders of Falmouth and a landowner, donated land out in what is now Hatchville, the corner of Hatchville and Sandwich Roads today. And that's where a very simple structure was built, the initial meeting house in the east end of town. It was probably a simple gabled roof structure. Its main entrance faced the small road, Hatchville Road. Its long side was facing the main road, which is Sandwich Road.
So in those days, you mentioned that the original meeting house down by Mill Road was constructed actually with town funds. So explain to us a little bit about how that worked, because in those days, as you know, those meeting houses were both civic spaces where people would gather, but also where people would worship.
Absolutely. This predates what we've come to think of as the separation of church and state. But prior to that point, it functioned as you say, a meeting house for civic affairs, for worship. Those structures, certainly Congregationalist meeting house, were very simple. And it was only probably early 1840s or so when this principle began to evolve that there should be a separation between government and church and religion, that meeting houses and worship spaces took on a decided Christian look. Spires were added, bells were added, as if to say we're now dedicating this space for religious purposes. Civic purposes might be held elsewhere. And so that's when many of those buildings begin to look more like a stereotypical New England church. And that was true for the East End Meeting House. 1842, a member of that congregation whose name was Shubael Lawrence, and I meant to look up the derivation of that name because it's certainly a biblical name, and to the best of my Hebrew knowledge, it probably means God's oath, Shuvah El. Regardless, he left a bequest in his estate. He said, I will leave to the East End Congregational Society the sum of $10,000 to be invested in what he described as good stocks, which will serve as a preaching and teaching endowment to fund a minister and his service to the community. And I'll give you that gift if you do the following. If you rotate the building 90 degrees so that the main entrance faces Sandwich Road, if you put up a spire and a bell, and if you agreed to maintain the cemetery behind the meeting house in perpetuity. The congregation jumped at that opportunity. It met his requirements within 2 years of his will being probated, and the meeting house really took on the look that it has to this very day.
So can you share with us, to the degree that you know, the evolution then of that building since that point? So
Sure.
over the last nearly 200 years, the occupants and the people who have gathered and
Right.
worshiped there.
So I've learned some interesting things about the building from reading and certainly from experiencing the building over the past few decades. When it was originally built, there were galleries on 3 sides of that building, upstairs galleries. Those galleries were designated for the poor and for servants. Pews down below, the fixed pews, were essentially sold to family members. When the building was rotated, 2 of the side galleries came down. There was a remaining gallery in the back, which still exists. The building really had no heat, not surprisingly. There were 2 pot-bellied stoves with long pipes going around sides of the building, not doing much. Records indicate that people would bring heated bricks. They would bring small portable stoves of some kind to set at their feet. And the pews had doors to try to keep out some of the draft. But it's hard to imagine that it was a very comfortable space, especially in winter weather. It's still a very beautiful building. Much of the glass windows are still the original glass. Through the years, the building suffered from the weight of that additional steeple and bell. Since the building was not originally designed to carry that weight, over the course of time, the roof began to experience some serious sag. So I'm jumping ahead now. So by the 1960s, that congregation had grown quite small, and it was hard to find the finances to maintain that building in the way that it needed to be. A society was formed, the East End Congregational Society, circa 1964, and it set about to do some serious fundraising to address some of those problems with the building, and it was quite successful in that regard. The building was used somewhat beyond that point. It was open to many different denominations who would use it, and almost exclusively in the summer by that point. Summer worship became a factor from the 1960s on. By about 1981, that group had grown so small that the decision was made to see if there might be another faith community interested in taking over that building and taking over the responsibility of maintaining it. And by happy coincidence, certainly for the Jewish community, that was right at the time when a fledgling Jewish congregation was being formed. Bob Ament, Jeff Oppenheim, 2 stalwarts of our community, were movers and shakers, both young men at the time, but they realized that there were probably enough Jews in Falmouth by that point to see if it would be feasible to pull together a congregation. And that's what happened around 1981. And around that time, this wonderful offer came from the East End Congregational Society. We'd like to offer you this historic meeting house. We'd like to offer you the parsonage house, which sits just down the road on Hatchville Road, as well as that preaching and teaching endowment. And it's my understanding that by 1981, that $10,000 was about $75,000. By the way, that $10,000 in 1842 would have been the equivalent of about $300,000 in 2020 dollars. So it was a significant gift. The Jewish community jumped at that opportunity. It was really quite extraordinary because the Jewish community had been meeting in St. Barnabas Church, in bank meeting rooms, and the opportunity to create a home was really just enormously powerful and wonderful. The meeting house was conveyed to the Jewish community. The Jewish community set about raising funds to make restorations and to do those things necessary to transform it into a synagogue. The parsonage house became offices and classrooms for this fledgling congregation. And the congregation took on the opportunity to maintain this building in perpetuity, as well as the cemetery behind it. So someone at the time approached the American Jewish Archives, premier historical research organization. And we received the really phenomenal message that to the best of its knowledge, this was the first time in recorded history of a Christian community donating its building to a Jewish community so that it might have a home to worship in, which is a pretty powerful story.
I until this very moment, didn't know that portion of the history. So what a remarkable example of the sense of community that to this day is woven through so many facets of our community.
Absolutely, Troy. Right around that time, circa 1983, the first Jewish service was held there on July 29th, 1983, a Sabbath service. And members from all over the community were invited and attended. Jewish communities need and go to great lengths to attain a Torah scroll. The Torah contains the 5 books of Moses and is read regularly in Jewish worship. The congregation did not have a Torah scroll, but was able to acquire one with a very special history. After World War II, it was discovered that the Nazis had collected Torah scrolls and Jewish ceremonial objects from all of the Jewish communities that they had destroyed in Europe. They gathered all those items in Prague and warehoused them. At the end of the war, they were discovered, including hundreds of Torah scrolls, some that were centuries old. In many cases, they were too far damaged to ever be used again. Those which could be restored were sent to a synagogue in Westminster, London, which became the repository for what are called Shoah scrolls. Shoah is the Hebrew word for devastation, the word referring to the Holocaust. Those scrolls that were able to be repaired were then made available on permanent loan to Jewish communities around the world. Falmouth Jewish congregation applied for one of those scrolls, and the cost of bringing it here, shipping it, insuring it, were donated by the Church of the Messiah in Woods Hole. So that church, that community, made possible a key element in the celebration of Jewish life and worship for our community. And that's a gift that remains firmly in the minds of our community ever since.
So really, the East End Meeting House symbolizes so much more than being simply a gathering place, but how it exists today is, based on the story you just shared, is one of the shining examples of community, really.
Absolutely, without question. By happy coincidence, the Hebrew word for a synagogue, 2 Hebrew words, beit, which means house, knesset, gathering or meeting. So Beit Knesset really can translate quite easily as a meeting house. And so it's very wonderful that the first worship space for our community was a Beit Knesset from 1797, a meeting house.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I'll just give a quick synopsis of what happened since then. The congregation had taken over the meeting house circa 1982, did the necessary restorations, and began to use it full-time for worship. The congregation grew quite quickly in the 1980s, and it became apparent by that point that it would need to expand, but there was no room around the meeting house for that expansion. So the congregation purchased 10 acres of land across Hatchville Road and built a building with the possibility of picking up that meeting house and moving it across the street and then joining it to the building which was designed for that new space. For various reasons that I won't go into, that didn't happen. The meeting house still sits in its original location, and we have another beautiful facility, our Seafer Community Center building, which has a chapel, classrooms, social hall, etc. So we have these 2 wonderful buildings. The meeting house is still used, although primarily in warm weather. We put in heating and air conditioning back in the 1980s, 90s. So it is certainly functional. But most of what we do takes place in our community center building. But that building remains a cherished part of our congregation, and hopefully always will be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this rich history with all of them.
You are very welcome. Thank you.